Welcome, everyone, to what we're calling our Grid Interactive School Bus Fleets webinar. Uh, Topic of the day is all things V2G, or maybe I should say V2X charging, um, specifically sort of in the world of school bus fleet electrification specifically. Um, my name is Taylor Sayward. I am on the business development team here at the Mobility House. I lead our work in the school bus space. I'm joined with a few other a colleague of mine at the Mobility House, and then a few other partners in the space who I'll let introduce themselves in just a moment. Just before that, there's just a couple nuts and bolts on the webinar side that I'll mention up front. We are recording this webinar. We'll be sharing this recording with all of the attendees and registrants after the webinar today, along with the slides, the handful of slides that we've got here. And if we will, of course, reserve some time at the end of this discussion for Q&A. Um, and Throughout the webinar, whenever you get the urge, you feel free to type a question into the Q&A chat box. I believe if you truly put a question mark at the end of that question, it lands in the proper Q&A sort of channel. That may be separate from the chat. I'm not a Zoom expert, uh, just being frank. So, with that, I think that's all kind of the nuts and bolts here. I've introduced myself. I think I'll just quickly pass the torch over to my colleague Elizabeth to introduce herself, and we can sort of go in turn here with introductions before getting into the meat and potatoes here.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Elizabeth Hughes. I am TMH's product systems architect, which is a really fancy way of saying I'm one of our friendly product nerds who thinks about how all of the technology and the landscape and all of the requirements from various entities kind of turn into basically what should our product do and what problems do we solve. So that's going to be the perspective I have today. I have a background in electrical engineering and I've been around in the space for quite a while. But I'll turn it over to Matt Velasco.
Awesome. Thank you so much. My name's Matt Velasco, and I'm the proud director of maintenance operations and transportation here at Pittsburgh Unified School District. I've been working in this space for about 9 years now, but been with public education for about 30 years. And we are working on a V2X. I'll take Taylor's lead on that, and working on a V2X project here in our district to add some fast charge or DC fast chargers, and exploring the what it looks like for vehicle to grid and vehicle to building. So looking forward to the program, and pass it to Greg.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me on. I'm Greg Kresge, Senior Manager of Utility Engagement and Transportation Electrification at World Resources Institute. I come to this organization with about 16 years in utilities. 12 of those were in electric utilities. Also having done virtual power plant and vehicle to grid for many years now, actually since 2015, I think. And we're participating with the Mobility House and Matt in Pittsburgh on several different projects across the nation. Matt is in Pittsburgh, but we're also working on some other projects in Colorado, New York, and a couple others in California as well. So really looking forward to the discussion. These are all V2X and resilience, and looking at school buses specifically as emergency mobile power supply assets. Thanks. And I'll pass it on to Brad. And Brad, nice to see you again in such a short period of time.
Good to see you as well. Good to see everybody today. I'm Brad Beauchamp, EV product segment leader at Bluebird, and we're actually getting close to, in the US and Canada, our 4,000th unit. So with that said, we've got a huge majority stake of school bus in the EV segment out in this marketplace. 3 years with Bluebird, but my first EV experience goes back to EV1 S10 electric days, which is surprisingly 30 years ago already. Now, you couldn't make a living at that totally, so I've done things on and off for the last 38 years related to advanced technology, alternative fuels, including fuel cells and obviously more recently, a lot of the battery electric and fuel cell efforts that have been going on. And at Bluebird, it's primarily been battery electric. So glad to be here. We're starting down that demonstration path in more steady ways with V2G, and look forward to having the dialogue that we have here today about it.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, if it wasn't clear at the top, I'll be moderating this sort of panel today. We've got a handful of questions on various topics for these folks here. But broadly speaking, right, we're going to be addressing a range of bidirectional charging use cases. We'll be talking interoperability between different parts of the system, and then we'll touch on some utility programs as well, sort of what those look like around the country, how they work for school bus fleet electrification. It's worth noting now that I'm seeing this participant numbers continue to climb into the 70s now. I've seen the registration list. We've got folks here attending today from everywhere you could imagine, right? We've got some school transportation folks, of course, but then we have a lot of stakeholders joining us from different utilities across the country, other industry groups, other technology companies like the Mobility House and so on. So this is, a 1 hour webinar. We'll just almost scratch the surface on this topic. It is a deep, deep rabbit hole. So we will attempt to, cover a few different things here to the best of our abilities. And again, we're sort of framing all of this, of course, within the context of school buses. And things do vary a little bit if we veer off into other vehicle types and so on. But that's sort of the frame of today's conversation. And with that, I would like to actually start with just kind of a high level question for Matt over at Pittsburgh USD. You already mentioned at the top the more than one V2X project going on there at Pittsburgh Unified. Could you please just share with everyone here kind of the high level overview of what's going on at Pittsburgh? Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Taylor. Just a little background on Pittsburgh Unified School District. So we're located in the East Bay of California with about 11,000 students enrolled. Majority of our students fall into the lower socioeconomic bandwidth, so we don't have any fees or charge costs for any of our transportation. Our current fleet is made up of 33 buses. We've got 7 EV buses on the ground, some propane buses, and we still operate a few diesel buses. And we're using renewable diesel in those buses. Our V2G, V2X efforts, they're really part of a much broader sustainability strategy that includes not only the electrification of our transportation and our vehicles, but also solar generations. We're working on developing some microgrids and that can help with some campus resiliency and a few other things. So specific to the project here, we're working with Mobility House and to develop our V2G chargers. So we're looking at a total of 5 chargers. Each of those will have 2 ports on them. They'll support fleet electrification. And I'm also looking at, what are going to be our future bidirectional capabilities and needs. The site that we're working at is a bit of a change from where we started. When we first started, we have we'll call it a corporate yard where our buses and vehicles are stored. And unfortunately, we had worked out. One of the reasons we're a little bit behind. We had worked out to add those chargers, the DC chargers here on the yard. But unfortunately, because we had already taken advantage of some other funding projects from our utility earlier, we didn't have the eligibility to have the increase in power that was needed and behind the meter improvements that were needed here. So we had to move the project to a school site that's directly south of us, directly west of us. So that's kind of slowed down the process a little. But just as kind of a broad statement, our interest in V2G it really does extend beyond just transportation. We really look at those school buses as energy assets that can be used to support and offset costs and peak shaving and resiliency. I know that's something that Greg mentioned. So and power outages. And then one of our second piece of the project is we're creating what we're calling a climate resiliency center, where we have a export only. I guess it's not a charger, but a device. It looks like a charger, but it exports only. So we'll be able to pull a bus up and power the multipurpose room and the kitchen so that we can provide services to our vulnerable population in the case of any type of climate or energy emergency. So we're still early on in the implementation phase. We really haven't got any of the construction started yet. But I would say one of the biggest takeaways that, early on in this process is that, planning probably long before the buses arrive on, to your site, really plan out what the needs are going to be, coordinate with the utility. My eagerness to just get the project going, kind of set us back because I should have really looked into what was the extent of the contract with the utility incentive that we had, prior, and that would have probably helped us expedite and choose another location that made sense. And then also I think the software integration and then really coordinating all of the stakeholders, bringing them into alignment, that does take a significant amount of time. So we're working through all of those things now, but to kind of say something kind of cheeky is like we're building the project while we're driving the bus. That's kind of all those things are happening in advance. So if I had some advice about the just a project so far, I think it's really long-term planning and meeting with your partners and getting assets and interests lined up much longer before you need them or you think you need them will really help.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, appreciate you sharing that. What I'm hearing too, right? Just to sort of distill that is there's two sites. One will have five bidirectional chargers doing like grid export V2G,
Mm-hmm.
and another site separately doing like backup power V2B.
Correct.
At the district there. Appreciate
Yep.
you.
Yes.
Greg, can I turn over to you? I know that you and your work at World Resources Institute, you're supporting schools all across the country with electrification projects, including at least a handful of bidirectional implementations. Can you give us kind of an overview of your work there? Trends you're seeing across the country, how you're seeing this type of technology pick up momentum?
Sure. Yeah. So we've not only have we seen that electrification is picking up, and there's a lot of volatility in the fuel market right now, and especially with diesel as a fuel source. But the other thing too is that we provide a lot of technical assistance, and when we give advice to school districts, we are looking at these assets, and we've had a lot of conversations around this and in many different aspects and conferences and things like that. What we're advising school districts to do is not take the short-term view. We're really advising them across the nation, and this is from coast to coast and up and down. We're all over the country. We've got projects that we're working with utilities on in New York and Virginia and Maryland and Texas and Arizona and California and Colorado, all over the place. So when we see this and school districts and transportation managers specifically are looking at electric school buses, we are trying to say, hey, look not only to the current situation and your charging capability that you might have now, but also realize that especially we've seen in the last, and Taylor, this, we've seen a tremendous amount of discussion around the grid and the capability of the grid and load capacity on the grid and the ability to meet increasing load demands. And that has also come into play with a lot of discussions around data centers and AI and things like that. So when we're saying that to transportation managers, when you're selecting a school bus, if you can select one that is already bidirectional capable, and Brad can talk to more about this, but that is a vehicle that is able to communicate with chargers already. Um, Invest in that because you're looking at an asset that is probably at least 12 years out. And if you don't engage in that sort of vehicle that is able to participate in those, when a program does come along, because we're seeing more and more of these programs that might offer compensation or the ability to participate or the ability to save yourself money at your site by offsetting demand charges or being able to control the charging or discharging in some cases and being able to get paid for that participation, then you're going to be out for 12 years. I mean, you want to try to engage or be forward looking and try to reduce your total cost of ownership. That's what we're really trying to do with these school buses because they are more expensive than diesel at this point. But when you start adding in all the benefits and actually some of the programs that are coming along that are paying for grid services and grid functions like vehicle to grid, like the project that Matt is going to be participating in with in the PG&E territory in the San Francisco Bay Area with the ELRP, which is the Emergency Load Reduction Program. That is a compensation mechanism. You want to be able to lower the cost of ownership, lower the cost of operation, be able to be compensated, and this is a grid asset. So when we go forward and we start looking at that, we really try to see what options are available for the school district, where they're at, how they can participate, and how they can set themselves up for a future of success, as opposed to being, limited by not having purchased the right vehicle or the right bus that can participate. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And a nice segue over to Brad on the bus OEM side. Brad, can you mentioned at the top you're nearing your 4,000th unit EV unit deployed. Can you give us any cliff notes or kind of highlights of deployments over the years across the country? How many of the Bluebird buses out there are doing any bidirectional charging, for example, or kind of what's the latest?
Sure, Taylor. All but of the nearly 4,000, all but maybe 500 have some sort of V2G capabilities to them. Starting in 2018-19 timeframe, the early deployments went out. A lot of that was, state funded, right? It was California, it was New York, it was other states in Massachusetts, and even some other states like Florida that had kind of early adoption strategies, Colorado. But we knew from the beginning, those first 500 that there was a call to have V2G capabilities in those buses. So now you've got these spread throughout 41 states and 4 Canadian provinces. In both the US and Canada, we do have, what I call a 2 dozen users that have in some way, shape, or form, when you say that's a small number, I'll explain why in a minute, but that in some way, shape, or form have done demonstrations, maybe not full deployment, but demonstrations of the benefits of V2G activity. Right now, because the interconnect is still a challenge, a lot of V2G is really vehicle to load or vehicle to building type exercises, or even to load means could mean a battery bank. We started out with the Dash 2 protocol, which was written back ISO wise in 2014. That came to life for us at the end of 2021, so about 3 years into production. And then the EPA Clean School Bus funding hit, right? And for everybody that's been involved in that supercharged the efforts for deployments. And that's where, numbers grew very quickly. During that time frame, we recognized the small V2G efforts that were out there on Dash 2. In our case, we had a very specific proprietary setup through the Cummins powertrain on the Bluebird bus through specific chargers. And we realized as EPA came out, we needed to broaden and expand more. So we immediately started pivoting toward the 2022 standard, uh, which was dash 20, the ISO 15118-20. And then that came to be full circle where it was fully deployed about April of last year. Like everybody in the V2G arena, you're watching for ISO, SAE, all the standards that are out there for UL, the charger side, the bus side, the battery side, the warranty side. You're making sure all that stuff lines up. And so rolling to today, Dash 20, now that it's, 4 years old, seems to be fairly solid. We've got some good partners out there on the actual infrastructure side. And then there's folks like the Mobility House that can do the charge management side and be able to actually provide the capabilities of V2G. The demonstrations are becoming more solid, right? They're smaller numbers, but they're becoming more solid to the point where I would expect to have some more deployment like where it's happening daily, yeah, coming soon. So where we're standing today is, a couple of dozen that we've been working with on the demonstration side. A few of those have gone down the Dash 20 path and have had successful Dash 20 exchanges. We on our Bluebird website actually kind of summarized what and who we've interop tested on the V2G side with. That doesn't mean that if you have a piece of hardware in your yard or you're thinking about something that it doesn't work. We just need to flush that out. So I would say we're right at the corner or the door of moving from a lot of demonstrations to moving into some full deployment.
Wonderful. Okay, I feel like we're sufficiently warmed up. And Elizabeth, now you get to take the hot seat because even just in these sort of initial comments, we cannot avoid getting into a lot of technical language, names of different standards, different types of communication protocols, and so on. But Elizabeth, just for the audience here, if we back up a little bit, can you sort of lay the foundation for us, and even more broadly than just V2G or bidirectional charging? Can you define what we, at least at the Mobility House, but I think this is becoming the norm across the industry, kind of broadly define what vehicle grid integration means, and then sort of highlight specifically the differences between some of the really common bidirectional charging use cases?
Yeah, of course. And I think we've heard a lot of great, already kind of themes in the various answers from our participants already. But you can think of vehicle grid integration as that umbrella term that covers basically everything that everyone's kind of already talked about before. It's basically any way that you can affect the charging of a vehicle so that it provides grid value or, generates value from EVs. In a unidirectional sense of things, kind of what everyone's already kind of aware of would be, doing basic bill management. That can look like time of use rates, that can be demand charge management. It can look like participating in more complex utility programs with dynamic rates, for instance. When you move into bidirectional, it's kind of like a yes and. So everything in the unidirectional category that I just covered, but also you start introducing more complex use cases, like Matt talked about in doing vehicle to building. There's also some abilities to do building load offset. So instead of just shifting your charging around, you could discharge your vehicles in case, your building load was high to do some bill management. There's also, you can do dynamic export around demand response or dynamic rates with export. And then there's also kind of this fourth category that's gaining more and more speed and application in the market that, Greg kind of pointed to, especially with load coming onto the network in more and more different ways, AIs, electrification, etc. And that's your bridge to wires, your non-wires alternatives, at a site level that could be considered automated load management, specifically the term in the National Electrical Code, so you don't have to oversubscribe your transformers or your sub panels, but that can also kind of extend up to the rest of the grid. And that's where your, flexible service connection slash flexible interconnection technology lives to start trying to avoid upgrades on the grid side of things. So basically, all of the above is VGI, and we can kind of already hear those themes of our participants already.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. And for everyone's sake, and just to kind of tie this back to Pittsburgh Unified, because we have Matt here, right, as we kind of framed at the top of this webinar here, right? At one of Pittsburgh's sites, they're going to be doing this grid export. They'll be participating in a demand response program. At another site, they'll have a different implementation whereby they'll have a bidirectional charger serving as a backup V2B resource. Um, can I keep you in the hot seat here, Elizabeth, and get you at least to sort of lay the foundation for a little discussion around interoperability, probably the
Yeah.
deep rabbit holes in this
Yeah.
area.
I mean, I'll try to build on to what Brad already was saying. He gave us a really wonderful history lesson there as to, how this slide might have changed over time. I'll try to do my best to add on to his expertise. But I want to lay out the ecosystem and what we're really talking about when we think about interoperability. Um, Specifically, it's usually something talking to something else. So one asset talking to another asset in the system. Generally, there's a communications protocol, aka a standard, involved in that communication. And that standard is in charge of governing basically data points flowing back and forth. The fancy word for that is telemetry, or doing functions back and forth. And so we can really kind of think about that as, there being a utility side of things, talking to CMSs or aggregators. You can think of those broad categories as there's, inverter requirements that are normally communicated via smart inverter languages, or there's event signals for, say, utility programs or DR responses. There are tons of different technologies in that space. I'm going to leave that off of like the rest of the kind of explanation, as that's its own 1 hour webinar and kind of PhD thesis apparently. So we'll not cover that. We're going to focus on like the top row here because that's, mostly what we're going to have the experts on the call for. So for the first thing I want to like point out is generally from a CMS to a charger type of things. We now have OCPP 2.1. That's what we're using in Pittsburgh. And it has kind of two appendixes that are really important for doing V2G. The first is bidirectional power transfer. That's Q if you're looking for it in the document. That's specifically sending the limits back and forth, like, hey, discharge now, hey, charge now, that type of stuff. And then we see also the DER control section, section R, if you're looking for it, that's really going to be passing those smart inverter requirements over to the chargers. But now that, OCPP 2.1 is out, it really is kind of that native pathway for CMSs to talk to chargers. Granted, it's still new. It's really important to have your CMS test with the various chargers that are on the market and have your manufacturers talk to each other. Matt already mentioned how important that is earlier on, so just want to kind of highlight that as well. And then we move on to the charger to the vehicle side of things, and Brad did a wonderful overview, so I'll just kind of summarize his points. There are vehicles that use Dash 2. And there are generally kind of two categories under Dash 2. There's proprietary ways of doing Dash 2. You're going to want to talk to your manufacturers and your chargers about those. But there's also non-proprietary ways of doing Dash 2 discharge. There's a SAE standard, I believe it's 2847/2. It's not widely applicable, but there are ways of doing it. And then we also see kind of the rewrite of ISO 15118 in its new Dash 20 form with kind of native out-of-the-box V2G capabilities. However, that is because it does have a full rewrite and does have more advanced, cybersecurity considerations and certificate exchanges and all these really complicated technical things. We see a slower release and rollout on the market. Generally, if you're going to ask me, hey, where does this go for interoperability in 10 years from now, Elizabeth? We'll see more and more of the market, take up Dash 20, but it's going to take a while to get there. Kind of in Brad's long-term view, we're kind of really standing on the precipice of, having these pilots go from more and more solid to wide mass scale deployment.
That feels like a nice moment to give the mic back to Brad for a second here, and I will try not to ask you three questions at once, Brad, but I think if you can comment at all, like, on when the rubber meets the road, like there are only so many commercially available bidirectional chargers on the market right now. If you can share with us, like, which chargers Bluebird buses have like undergone the right interoperability tests, please do so. But also, I think more importantly, almost, can you share with us anything about and you've already said some of this, how Bluebird has been thinking about the difference and the sort of shift between these two ICE implementations and how you're managing the sort of shift and how you're managing these implementations as the standards are evolving in real time. I imagine that's a challenge, obviously.
Yeah, very good questions. To answer the first part, um, because our primary propulsion system is Cummins, which was EDI originally, got bought out by Cummins, and then Cummins spun off into Accelera. That's been of the 4,000. That's a majority of them out there. 90% are based off of Cummins. We were able to provide Cummins the standard, right? And then they actually worked early on the Dash 2 implementation that we launched in November of 21. The cool thing, the caveat to this is, yeah, you can siphon diesel out of a diesel bus, or you can siphon gasoline out of a gasoline bus. You can even pump propane into a propane cylinder out of a propane bus. So, any one of these exports energy, right? But V2G, it's built right into the bus. So this Dash 2 was a way to actually not have to, yeah, truly have a transaction that was siphoning. This is simply plugging in a charger. So as we rolled into the Dash 2 implementation, we had basically one solution. At that time, it was Nuvi, and it was over a Rhombus charger, which got acquired by Borg Warner, and then the Borg Warner charger got discontinued. And so Dash 2, again, we did probably 24 implementations in the demonstration side, proved itself out. But as we moved to Dash 20, we all got wiser from the experience we got through Dash 2 and said, okay, let's have Cummins bench test and field test some of the Dash 20 implementations. So Telus was the first one. Heliox also ran through it, which Cummins actually brands their chargers that are produced by Heliox for Cummins use. And then InCharge. So those three chargers actually went to Cummins. Cummins then bench tested and field tested. And then when we were ready in April of last year, we started having every charge control unit on the buses programmed to be both Dash 2 and Dash 20 compatible. So if you had one of the older chargers from Borg Warner and you were using Nuvi on top of it, you'd be able to use the newer bus with that older charger. What we've already learned is Dash 20 is far more solid. It's smarter to do that interop testing. So again, if it's not one of those three chargers, or your charge management software you have today, isn't, in the case of in control that InCharge has, or the Mobility House software where we're working together, same thing, trying to make Dash 20 work with various EVSEs. No worries, we can go through that same process. We've also used some resources now that we've added to our own build center to try to do some of that work at Bluebird as well. And then we sometimes third party out, right? Sometimes you need to go to a site where you can actually do that interop testing. But it showed us with Dash 2 how important doing that interop testing is as we rolled into Dash 20. So we have, three solid choices today, and then as people come to us with additional, certainly we would go through that same path. But it's super important to spend the time to make sure that everything on the bus side, on the charger side, on the charge management software side, and even where you're sending that energy is set up and ready to go.
And Greg, can I ask you a question, sort of like from your with your utility background and your perspective all across the country, when as utilities and other sort of funding or agencies that are standing up either funding programs or utility programs um, to enable this type of technology. Can you comment on like the importance or the benefits or challenges of having either requirements or sort of guidance on equipment and standards like this in those programs, right? Like, is it valuable to have really hard requirements that say you can do this program or get this funding if you have standard X, Y, and Z? Maybe there's pros and cons to that. I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, this is kind of expanding on what everybody else has said so far, but There's a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of utilities that are really seeing the value of managed charging and controlling the charge and being able to stay off of peak. And then in addition, there's a lot more acceptability amongst regulators and utilities about showing these as grid assets, which means that they're beneficial to all ratepayers, right? Which means that the worst case scenario is you come back from your route at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you plug in your bus and it just charges unmanaged. You're just charging the bus when everybody else is also on peak at the same time. So you have a whole bunch of things that happen in that space if there's no utility control or the ability to be able to dispatch those resources or be able to manage them so they stay off peak. Because as the peak grows, more and more inefficient generation usually has to come online. And these are called peaker plants, right? Which is, hey, I need to meet this higher peak load from 5 to 10 p.m., which is kind of a traditional peak that a lot of people see. And if that is done without any management, then what happens is those more efficient units, inefficient units come online. There's more emissions in the air. The price of electricity goes up. And we're not using the most efficient units, and we're having to carry more reserve to be able to meet those demands. And that's kind of getting into the weeds on the utility side. But the thing is that when regulators and when utilities and see these value stacks with the electric vehicles and being able to manage and move that charging away from the peak or be able to be grid assistive, if you're able to, for example, charge the bus with solar or DER on-site generation, or you have a grid like mine. I live in Hawaii. We have excess energy in the middle of the day. We're actually curtailing some, production. We don't want to do that. That's a perfect example of a place to like plug in your vehicle. Let's put those renewable electrons into that vehicle instead of fossil fuel or having to do it when it's on peak. So with these utility programs, they should be grid assistive. And it's important that people understand that this is not, for a long time, I think we've been working in silos, which has been, we're coming into it as, well, let's say, for example, Mobility House, you guys are the charger network operator, you manage the charger, you make sure that the signals are going through the dashboard, you're using your software to be able to manage that charging environment. But it has to actually go from the vehicle all the way to the utility and all the way back. So there's these huge chains of communication, and without standards, those communications can get broken very easily. And when the utility is funding some of these projects, we're seeing across the nation right now where utilities are funding everything. For example, they're funding the bus, they're funding the charger, they're funding the construction or the conduit, the basic, cables that go into the ground, that connect to the panel, that go all the way behind the meter. And they're actually funding some of these vehicles and chargers and the whole environment because they realize that these are grid assets that if they can bring them online and be able to manage them, they can be super grid assistive. That all takes this communication chain from end to end. So now I feel like we're coming together. We've got, you guys all represent different aspects of that chain where it's from end to end. It's from the vehicle, Brad, to through Mobility House to the utility, and then back again to be able to make sure that those communications are going to make their way. It's dispatchable when you need it, whether that's a cloud-based environment at the moment or whether in the future we're probably going to be seeing more and more of direct dispatch, where some of these fleet vehicles, these fleet sites will be actually integrated into DERMS, into the distributed energy management systems by the utilities so that they can call upon those assets. Until we get all of that standardized communication, that's going to be really difficult to do. So now we're coming out of this silo environment and we're all looking at this common kind of light at the end of the tunnel of if we can get this all done well and within these standards, then everything can play together. So if these funds are going to be made available to a specific consumer, then it's coming from the utility, then it would be in the utility's best interest to make sure that those standards are implemented and that they're, carried through with their particular funding mechanism that they're coming to the table with, because it's expensive. The chargers are more expensive, the construction is more expensive, the panels are more expensive, but looking at the long-term vision down the road, as this grows, you're going to be getting more and more and more of these fleet vehicles and these buses, and electric school buses have always been kind of like the poster child for, hey, if we can do it anywhere, we should be able to do it here, because these are super predictable vehicles. They have long dwell times. They go long periods of time without being used or for student transportation, and they're the perfect resource to be able to do this.
Mhm. There, a few things you said there make I think, a nice segue to get into a little bit of maybe our final chapter of the webinar here, which is kind of on the topic of utility programs more broadly. And I'll hand the mic back to Elizabeth. But Elizabeth, can you share with us, or can you sort of again like frame this idea of utility programs and describe sort of the different range or spectrum of types of programs are out there and what they are meant to achieve anyways. I think that is, understanding what's in it for the customer, what's in it for the utility, what the benefits are for all the different stakeholders it's like helpful for end users to understand as they, try and get buy-in and enroll in programs and so on. Like, what is the benefit for all the different stakeholders in the mix?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, Greg already covered a lot of it, so I'll try to be brief in my answer. But the first thing is, how do you classify programs? Really, all of our practitioners here at the Mobility House, when asked this question prior to this webinar, kind of all gave different answers. And really that led to a way of thinking about programs through different lenses and kind of their subclassifications. So you can think about programs, about how they affect a customer's bill. Are they targeting energy charges? Or are they targeting about demand charges? Or are they, you can think about programs as how they're helping the utility. Are they particularly designed for, say, emergency events like wildfires, or, there to help prevent rolling blackouts? Or are they more, to what Greg's point was, which is, basically cost-effective operation of the grid and shifting away from the usage of peaker plants? You could classify programs by eligibility. Do customers have to be on a specific rate? Do they have a specific type of asset? The list goes on and on there. And then you could also think about, programs as, are they primarily targeted at import or like load resources, or are they primarily targeted at generation resources? In terms of, what benefit they provide the utility, I already kind of said that a little bit, and Greg definitely did a really good job of talking about a lot of programs being, aimed at cost effectively running the grid and shifting consumption to times where, we have to we can use cheaper things in the stack. But also there are those kind of more emergency based programs. And it's really going to be specifically about, whatever the local utility needs. In a broader sense, if you're trying to understand, hey, where does this program fit in the landscape? I was given a tip to do the famous thing of following the money. If you figure out how a program is funded and by what mechanisms and by how the events are called, et cetera, you can really kind of find the story of what that program is doing and what benefits there are to both the customer but also to the utility if you kind of follow the money.
Cool. Maybe I forgot to move on to a slide here to the following slide. But this kind of brings me to a question for Greg again, actually briefly. And right, this map that I'm showing is not in service of patting the mobility house on the back necessarily, but I think it sort of speaks to the range of different use cases and the different types of utility programs that we've been talking about. They are right. They are relevant if they are if they exist where you are operating your fleet, of course, right? This map here, again, just pulling this up to a kind of showcase a few of the different use cases that we have projects sort of in implementation stage and in operations across the country, but also where geographically those programs exist, and therefore where this technology is most relevant and like possible to again put things in the ground and get a site up and running now, right? And I don't want anyone to be under the impression that the Mobility House thinks we're the only ones in the country doing this, the only technology provider doing this. So, Greg, really looking to you. Like, I know you mentioned a couple other geographies at the top of this call, but could you sort of highlight any trends and or like places on the map that are not represented, by projects that we have in the ground? Because I know you're working all over the country with stakeholders everywhere. It'd be nice to hear, for folks sitting in different parts of the country, hey, is this relevant for me? How can I learn more about what's available in my utility territory?
I'm gonna jump to a great example because we are today and this week, and we're going to see more of this. We're hearing about heat domes and all of these locations that typically don't experience huge swings in temperature. They're seeing major swings in temperature right now, all the way from Seattle, New York, all over the globe. We're seeing these, in the past, relatively temperate climates are now seeing extreme heat events. What we're doing in specifically in Colorado, and this is also going to be Matt's project in Pittsburgh. One of his applications for this is going to be this vehicle to building aspect. And what this really does is it enhances resiliency. So we are working with several school districts around looking at that possibility where they can provide community services. And it's a little bit of a difficult situation because there's not a real we can't point to a specific dollar value when it comes to a resilience aspect. But with these cooling centers, just to let you know that, there are going to be a lot of people across the nation that are going to be affected by these extreme temperatures where they can't cool themselves in their own house. They're going to have to seek shelter, or if there's a grid outage, because the two tend to go hand in hand, which is these public safety power shutoff events, because the heat is so high, because there's potentially drought conditions, we are seeing more and more, emphasis in addressing, say, for example, wildfire concerns. And utilities are, they're very concerned. We have several examples now, including my home state that I'm in, where, wildfire mitigation and shutting off the power is going to become more and more of a standard practice if there's high winds, dry conditions and extreme heat. If that happens and people, let's say, for example, they live in a location where that power goes off and they don't have the ability to cool themselves down, they're going to seek shelter, and that shelter is probably going to need to provide air conditioning or, refrigeration services or something like that. We are seeing more and more. There isn't a group that I talk to that isn't interested in this aspect. It's just a little bit hard to monetize. We're trying to get more and more information about that, but also realizing that not everything has to be in one location. So one thing I want to point out to, with Matt's project in California, as well as the one in Colorado, we're trying to get these lessons learned so that we can, basically give some advice of like, if you're looking to do this in your location, here are some things that you should consider first and look at first to see if this is the right spot, or, some of the other things that we've learned in these other projects, which can, cause delays, a lot of time delays, or they put you into more of a crisis mode and have to scramble and reconfigure things. We are seeing that, in these two particular examples in Pittsburgh as well as in Colorado, The buses actually have a depot that's in a different location. We are looking at these as these mobile assets that can be driven, especially if they're short distances. They're not going to draw a lot on the battery, so there's going to be a lot of battery capacity still left over, and they can make it to a resiliency center and be able to power that resiliency center if there is a PSPS event or there's a grid outage. And the community can still be served. There's a tremendous amount of value in that. We're seeing applications, for example, in Texas and New Mexico, where we have utilities, and the utilities are at the center of this. I mean, there's a lot of utilities that are extremely interested in this. Um, they are a huge participant in this because they're responsible for the interconnection and the approval of this, especially if there's power that's going to be sent back to the grid, that it gets done safely, or if it's isolated from the grid, that it doesn't inadvertently energize a line that's down or something like that. So it needs to stay safe. We are working with all over the nation, for example, in Texas and New Mexico. They have a large population that are mobile home dwellers. When mobile home dwellers have ambient temperatures outside that exceed 100, 105 degrees, they're no longer able to cool down their environment. It turns into an oven. It doesn't decrease in temperature. They actually have to leave. Now, if the ambient temperature outside is like, for example, in Arizona or one of the other southern states where it's 110 degrees outside or 119, where do they need to go? So we're looking at these applications. This also helps the utilities as well, because if there's going to be load mitigation or there's an event where they're calling the grid outage because of some of these extreme events, then they also can be assured that the community needs are being met while you know, they're really focusing on the safety of the whole system and the grid and being able to still meet the needs of some of the community. So we're looking at projects they're not on the map, but we're looking at projects um, in in the central part of the United States. So we're looking at Wisconsin and Minneapolis and Minnesota, in addition to Michigan, um, in addition to a lot of southern states as well. So there's a lot of interest in this moving forward. I think that we're getting closer and closer to seeing more and more of these demonstratable and hopefully a little bit more of the out of the box approach where these devices are available, the buses are available, and the management is very capable.
Yeah, it speaks to, there's a question in the Q&A that I'm seeing actually already that is effectively, hey, if I'm not aware or if there's not a program accessible to me where I live in my utility territory right now, could I be planning ahead for V2G charging? I think the answer is absolutely. It sounds like there's a lot of interest
Absolutely.
across the country for this stuff and for good reasons. And I've definitely seen and heard, utilities really doing some of the early development work on programs like this before customers are even aware. So it warrants asking the people in your orbit, of course. Um, so there's just 5 minutes left, and there's another question in the Q&A that I'll point to Brad, and then I've got one what I think is maybe one of the most important questions for Matt to wrap us up here. But Brad, we've got a question or two sort of related in the chat about what is effectively like additional throughput on the batteries if school buses are being used for bidirectional charging. Can you give us any insight into um, how that additional throughput impacts the battery, the chemistry, and so on, and if there's that brings you closer to any warranty implications for the vehicle itself and so on? It's a really common question we hear a lot. I'm sure you do too. Oh, you're muted, Brad.
Yep. Those are common questions that do come up. And the good news is the actual Cummins Accelera warranty on the PowerDrive 7000 system that we supply with the Bluebird bus does actually spell out gross discharge, which is just like having a meter on that bus, right, for the battery. And for the current V2G buses that are out there, It's warranted up to 75% of its total usable capacity for 390 megawatt hour of throughput. So so it's expecting that if it's not time and mileage, right, 8 years, it's unlimited miles that we would monitor throughput. The second part of it is on just on its effect on longevity. Again, 7 going into our 8th year of deployments. We are not seeing, and this is the same thing for all commercial EVs right now, and even your retail, personal passenger cars that are EVs. We're not seeing major degradation in batteries. These batteries are lasting longer than typically the life of the vehicle is. So on our side, we know that a lot of these are going to have a second life and may serve you as battery backup or battery storage. So we're warranted to protect you today with V2G activities or V2B activities, V2X activities off of the bus as far as the warranty goes. But because of track record of the past 7 going on 8 years, it's more than likely that this bus will serve that purpose and then still have the ability to serve a second life as well.
Yeah, great. Okay, we're just about at time here. I'm going to do 2 things at once. I'm going to pull up our last slide just for anybody who needs to trickle out. Please feel free to reach out to myself or any of the panelists here. But I want to wrap up with a question for Matt on a less technical topic, but not an uncomplex one, and that is kind of buy-in and participation with other stakeholders. In your case, at a school district, right? Implementing this type of technology, enrolling in a utility program. This is not, I imagine, just a siloed effort within the transportation department. Can you speak to like the ways and the other stakeholders you're working with internally and how maybe the importance of getting that buy-in outside of your own sort of domain at the transportation yard?
Sure, I'll give this a quick one because I know we're at time. But as you mentioned, Taylor, this is transport. This is not these projects aren't transportation projects. They have obviously transportation involved because of the school bus. But these are facilities and a maintenance and operations um, a component because you're talking about building out charging infrastructure that becomes part of the district's systems and electrical needs and capacities. The business team. So let's talk about like finance, your CBO, your superintendent. I really think that they need to have a good understanding of what the incentives are, how the utility rates are going to be impacted by, changes in how we're getting power and giving power back and forth. I think also the grant opportunities, thank goodness for CEC that has funded, this project. But it's just with the condition of school districts' finances right now, those there's just not a lot of good opportunities. So grant opportunities, and then I also think long-term return on investment. What does that look like? How does that impact the long-term budget, not on operations as we work on peak shaving and incentives that are going to come back to the districts for having these projects. Where do those funds go? As how can they be used to fill in gaps? I think one of the key components that I know that we left out was really getting IT involved. IT is going to have a big piece of how this is going to react on the network, of the district. What is that gonna? Is there going to be impacts on that? What are going to be the needs of connectivity there? And then I think lastly, getting the support of the board, really making sure the board understands how how these projects are going to really support a much bigger picture, not just transportation, but the bigger picture of the community efforts and also sustainability. Sustainability is something that we've codified in our board policies. So it's not a Matt Belasco a project or something that I'm working on, but these are actually board required sustainability that needs to be built into the different projects, and we need to be thinking about those. And then I think lastly, utility utility partners are going to be definitely a key. And informing our community stakeholders how we're working through these processes and getting that information out to them. In my opinion, I think that a successful V2G project, as I've said in the beginning, it's not a transportation project. These are district projects as a whole, entire school district. They require an intense amount of alignment amongst all these different, entities, stakeholders, and interdistrict departments, external departments, utilities. So there's just definitely a lot of coordination. And I think the rest of the panelists, I think we everybody touched on that in one sense or another of how important it is to get that planning out there, talk to your partners, and make sure that they're aware of what the goals are so that the projects can truly be successful.
Yeah, no, for sure. It takes a village. Tip of the hat to you for the leadership there at Pittsburgh Unified, obviously. Thanks for the great work you're doing. Thanks to
Thank
all
you.
of the panelists here. Appreciate everyone who joined this webinar. Again, we'll share around a recording here, these slides, and please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.